Trump is very keen to appear to do a deal with Putin pretty much over Zelensky's head. And I think it's certainly immoral. I think it's illegal and unconstitutional.
Well, that's one view of the Donald Trump peace plan for Ukraine. But I wonder what you think. Let's find out some more details in the second edition of the Stewart White Podcast. When you hear the new head of MI6 say we are living in a space between peace and war, do you agree with that statement?
Entirely. There is a term called hybrid warfare, and I think it's a way of describing that space between peace and war. Conflict isn't something that is declared or undeclared. Conflict is a situation where there are states or organizations that are disagreeing with each other and carrying that disagreement in a variety of ways. And what we're seeing with Russia, a resurgent Russia, and we've been talking about a resurgent Russia for many, many years. Putin has got aggressive instincts. We're seeing them quite clearly in a very obvious way in Ukraine. But scrape him to the core, you've got an unreconstructed KGB colonel whose beloved Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact was destroyed by the solidarity of the West in the late 1980s. He would love nothing more than to see the West in disarray, to see NATO members disagreeing amongst themselves. And Ukraine is one very good way for him to do that. What I think a lot of people are very concerned about is that at some point in the future, he will press not to try and invade or attack or take over another NATO member, but to make an incursion, say, into Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, to test the strength of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Is an attack on one an attack on all? Would Trump go to war for Estonia?
So the rise of Putin's ambition, do you put that down to Donald Trump in the White House, or is this something he was always going to do, do you think?
Putin has been developing his own thinking as far as Russia is concerned, his desire for a greater Russia right back to the last few years of the Cold War. Pre-Yeltsin, pre-Gorbachev, the Soviet Union seemed pretty solid. Warsaw Pact seemed pretty solid. He was a KGB colonel, very happily getting on with doing whatever KGB colonels did. And I think was pretty aghast at the way Perestroika and Gorbachev's initiatives created the chinks in the Berlin Wall that eventually led the Berlin Wall to come down. And it undoubtedly was, as I was saying just now, because of the solidarity of NATO and the leadership of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that led the West to be stronger than the Soviet Union, such that the Soviet Union then broke up. And of course, this is also part and parcel of the story as far as Ukraine is concerned, because in 1991, 1992, there was a very active discussion as to whether the Donbass provinces, largely Russian-speaking, looking more towards Russia than Ukraine, would be Ukrainian or would be Russian. And it was decided that they would be Ukrainian. And when Ukraine was voted to be a sovereign state, those Donbass provinces are Ukrainian. Now, he hasn't accepted that. He takes literally that the word Ukraine translates into borderlands. As far as he's concerned, Ukraine isn't a legitimate country. It is the border area of Russia, and he wants to take that back. And going back to the days of the Cold War, there was never any question of Ukraine not being part of the greater Soviet Union, in his mind, the greater Russia.
How good an army and how good a military does he have?
Well, he thought up till February 2022 that he had reinvested extremely well in his military, and that his security services, having sufficiently undermined the regime in Kyiv, he could use his remodeled military to give the regime in Kyiv a sharp tap, and it would fall. It turned out, if you go back right to February, March, April 2022, virtually every military mistake that could have been made that are in the handbook, and a few that aren't in the handbook, were made by the Russian military. Their performance was abject. The Ukrainians surprised us all by fighting back so hard, and we and other countries stepped up very, very quickly to support them. Now, what we've seen over the last 2, 3, 4 years now is the Russians reverting to their traditional meat grinder tactics, careless with human life. Getting on for 1.2 million killed and wounded is the current casualty figure. Probably amongst that, probably about a third of those killed, the others injured. I mean, that is a huge manpower toll. they say that they are advancing. They are advancing very slowly at huge cost. We're not necessarily talking about the war itself, but and there are discussions going on of an EU summit today about various aspects of that war. But if you take the hard line as far as Ukraine is concerned, if the West continues, European countries continue to support Ukraine, both with cash and weapons and know-how and intelligence, particularly giving them long-range missiles, imposing harsher, more strongly policed sanctions, I think we will see pressure building on Putin. The Russian people are starting to suffer themselves. Their inflation is running high, interest rates are high, their standard of living is going down, and it will tell over time. So there is a very respectable point of view to say that if the West continues its support to Ukraine, eventually Putin may feel that it's in his interest to come to the table, not tap Trump along and force Zelensky into things that Zelensky doesn't want to do.
But without Trump, can the world afford to take on his army?
Well, this gets back to the whole issue of Trump saying that we Europeans must take a greater degree of responsibility for our own security. And he's right as far as that's concerned. That's probably about the only thing I think he's right on, if I'm absolutely honest. But it will take time, and it is taking time, for European governments to decide to spend more of their scarce resources on defence and start to backfill the important military capabilities that hitherto the United States has provided NATO and therefore has provided Europe.
Before the Second World War, there was appeasement of what Hitler was doing. And there appears to be, in some quarters, appeasement now about what Putin is doing. So are we treading a path we should have learned from before and not trodden on this path?
Well, if you've read a book called Victory to Defeat, Britain and Her Army, 1918 to 1940, you will see that two authors, one of whom which you're talking to now, very much wrote that the parallels between today and the 1930s are very strong. Just a couple of figures, or actually three figures, I think that are quite significant. In 1935, we were spending just less than 3% of GDP on defence, and we failed to either appease or to deter Hitler. In 1939, when the war broke out, that shot up to 19%. And in 1940, when we were fighting for our very survival, that was 46%. That is the dire, disastrous cost of fighting a war, which you could otherwise have prevented by paying the premium at the right time to make sure your military capability was strong enough to deter a potential aggressor. We failed to do it in the 1930s. We are failing to do it today.
When you look at the map, of course, Russia is a long way from us, it seems. So are we really as vulnerable as perhaps some of those states like Poland?
We are vulnerable in different ways. We are vulnerable. We think in many ways that one of our strengths is we are an island. But a weakness is that we are an island. So much of our communications, our energy, come from undersea pipelines and fibre optic cables and all the rest of it in the North Sea. And they are very vulnerable. We've seen a Russian diplomat being poisoned in this country. I was hacked by the Russians last year. We've seen Jaguar having its production interrupted. The spy ship off the coast of Scotland. There is a large number of ways in which we are vulnerable. And we are in this hybrid situation. We are in this space where this conversation started between peace and war. So yes, or should I say no, we're not like Estonia. We've got with the Russians just over there, although there are British troops in Estonia looking at the Russians just over there. So to that extent, we're vulnerable. But we're vulnerable in different ways.
You were hacked. How did that work? How do you know it was the Russians?
Because the National Cybersecurity Centre told me so.
And why do you think they were doing that?
I think they like to pick high-profile people whose views they don't agree with and try and take them down.
And you say we have troops in that part of Europe, but actually we've had them in Ukraine because somebody was injured only the other day. So how close are we to actually sending in troops there, do you think?
Well, you're suggesting that we've got some British troops in Ukraine. I think the government's line is we neither confirm nor deny the activities of our special forces, who may or may not be there or may not be somewhere else. Yes, of course, a British soldier was killed the other day, so self-evidently he was in Ukraine. But we understand that he was nowhere near the front line, which is a different issue. Of course, we are supporting Ukraine in many, many ways. Better part of 20,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained in this country, trained in basic infantry skills here in Norfolk, at the battle area near Thetford. Almost the largest user currently are Ukrainian troops training there. It's interesting how the war has developed over the last 4 years. We had the expertise which we were passing on to them. They now have the expertise which they're passing back to us. So if we have got some people in Ukraine, we're probably there as much learning as we are teaching. And the most experienced, battle-hardened Western European army in the world today is the Ukrainian army. And we'd be foolish if we didn't learn lessons from them.
Are we on full alert here? Because I've spoken to lots of people, I've seen it myself, but we've had lots of activity in the air over Norfolk. I saw Chinook come in very, very low over my part of Norfolk only this week.
Probably lost.
But you do not think we're on a full alert here yet?
No, we're not. No. I think that the armed forces are aware of the threat. The government talks about being aware of the threat, but that talk has not been transferred or translated into increased defence expenditure. Prime Minister has talked about raising our percentage of GDP to 3.5% by the end of the next Parliament. That's 2035. That's a bit like saying to Hitler in 1935, hey, don't attack us till 1945 because we're not ready.
And if we spend the amount of money that you think we need to spend, how would our armed forces be different? Would we be better armed? Would we have more men? How would it be?
We'd have all of those things. I think one of the things we absolutely need to do as a matter of urgency is not just replenish, but increase our war stocks of ammunition and missiles. And that is only going to happen when the government or the Ministry of Defence is prepared to let contracts to British industry so that British industry can tool up its factories and its workforces to start generating the amount of supplies that we need. And that's not happening at the present moment. We live in a capitalist society as opposed to a directed economy. And if contracts are not being let and industry does not believe that the money is going to flow and follow those contracts, they're not going to be firing up their capability. And that's not happening fast enough at the present moment. Go beyond that, we need to increase our equipment holdings in the air, on land, and at sea, and under the sea.
Because ours is a peace economy, and the stories are that Putin's now is a war economy. And how do we move from a peace economy to being on a war footing?
Well, it has to come down to the flow of money, because we live in a capitalist society, and BAE Systems and other defence manufacturing companies are not going to increase their capability until they are confident that contracts which the Ministry of Defence want to let will be honoured and money will be paid, and therefore they will invest properly in increasing our capability. We've got 2 aircraft carriers, for example. We've only so far managed to buy half the number of aircraft that we said originally we needed to fly off those. Now, at about $100 million apiece, that's huge expense. The Royal Navy has never had as few a number of frigates and destroyers as they currently have at the present moment. The British Army has never been as small in modern history. The Army of the 3 services is the most underinvested. When the decision was taken by the Defence Board, which I was on in 2007, to fully fund the 2 aircraft carriers, at that point, the funding for the Army's Armoured Fighting Vehicle Replacement Programme was pulled and has not been replaced since. We managed to get away with it to the extent that we did in Iraq and Afghanistan with cobbled together equipments, which were useful for saving lives in Iraq and Afghanistan, but have no place on a modern battlefield. On a modern battlefield, you need main battle tanks and armoured infantry fighting vehicles, both of which have got similar sort of mobility capabilities, supported by artillery, supported by air, supported by attack helicopters. We're short of all these things.
Old-fashioned warfare, isn't that what I say? Old-fashioned, that we won't actually engage on the battlefield in the way that we did in previous wars.
That's what people would like us to think. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. The analogy, which I think is fair, is of a bag of golf clubs. Just because you've got a snazzy new number 9 iron doesn't mean to say you can throw away your driver. You're going to need your driver on occasions. You're going to need your 9 iron and your sandwich on occasions. And as technology moves, better weapons, better clubs are invented. But it doesn't mean to say the old ones are therefore redundant. If you look at the course of the war in Ukraine over the last 4 years, main battle tanks, conventional artillery have all played a role. Now, what we're seeing now is 3/4 of the casualties being imposed by drones and guided bombs and so on and so forth. But that does not mean that in a future war, it will be drones and drones and drones. It will be main battle tanks, armoured infantry fighting vehicles, rockets, gun artillery, and drones, and whatever else clever scientists come up with next.
Part of the problem is surely that in this country, we are surrounded by water. And so we think that tanks are not going to be needed, for us at least. Is that fair?
I don't envisage a tank battle taking place in Norfolk or indeed on the south coast. But it's really a question of how seriously we take our role as a European member of NATO. Going back to the days of the Cold War, we had 55,000 troops in Germany, 4 armoured divisions in Germany, and we quite seriously expected to play our part in countering the Warsaw Pact. Third Shock Army was lined up against us in the Northern Army Group, and that's who we expected to fight. So the question is, in a future situation, is it acceptable within NATO terms for the UK to say, okay, Germans, Poles, you can do the armoured fighting. We'll provide some ships and we'll provide some aircraft. We won't bother to provide any soldiers. I think there is somewhere between a moral obligation and an absolute necessity to have some skin in the game on the battlefield. And I think we would find it absolutely necessary to deploy troops on the ground.
So the Prime Minister calls you and says, what do I need to do to stop Putin today? What would you say?
Well, first of all, I think I'd say to him he's got to go next door to Rachel Reeves at number 11 and say you've got to rejig the nation's priorities on spending. You've got to put more money into the Ministry of Defence in a short time frame for exactly the reasons I was discussing before, in order to fire up British industry to provide the equipment that we need, the ammunition and the missiles that we need to be ready. I think we have also then got to look at our overall capability and ask ourselves the question, are we, as we would like to think we are, the leading European NATO member in Europe? Are we playing our part? If you ask the Supreme Allied Commander Europe today, is the UK playing its part in NATO? He would say no, in resounding American terms. We are not matching up to our stated pledges of support to NATO in really any of the major environments. So it's the legacy of 30 years of peace dividends that we're now having to pay for. We've taken risk, we've piled risk on risk, and that risk is coming home to roost.
Traditionally, we've always said to stop a bully, you perhaps give him a bloody nose.
Yes.
Is that what we do with Putin?
Why not? But we should. We don't want to give him a bloody nose, but we want to show to him that we are serious about our own security, serious about our own defence, and that we have a set of armed forces, along with our European allies, that are sufficiently credible to deter any adventurism that he might otherwise be minded to embark on.
And when people talk about Putin, they say that he dislikes us more than most other European countries. Is that true?
The short answer to that question is I don't know. Putin, I think, rather like Trump, is hard to read. Although, if you look at his expressions on television, particularly with having meetings in recent time, he looks fairly complacent and fairly pleased with himself. I think he thinks he's winning. I don't know what he's being told. I suspect he's being told what his advisors want him to hear. He probably thinks he's doing better in Ukraine than he is. We talked a few minutes ago about the land war in Ukraine. His naval war is going extremely badly. The Russian Navy has pretty much vacated the Black Sea, and that's facing a Ukrainian Navy that doesn't have any ships. They've used modern technology extraordinarily well.
If you were leading the army in Russia today, what would you be saying to your leader if you could say what you wanted to say?
Well, going right back to the start of this war, when one wondered after the initial attacks by the Russians were so unsuccessful and their casualty rate was so high, one wondered who would have the moral courage to say to Putin, actually, you're doing the wrong thing. And I think the Chief of the General Staff, who is still the Chief of the General Staff, I thought at the time that he might have been one of those people who might have said, actually, what your adventurism has done has pretty much destroyed the army that I've been trying to build up on behalf of you, Vladimir Putin, and on behalf of Russia. I think the time has come to stop. Now, that hasn't happened over the last three or 4 years. And they are condemned, I think is the right word, to continuing with their meat grinder tactics, which are causing 1,100 casualties a day. And that's the figure that's been going on throughout this year, getting towards that 1.2 million figure.
You said earlier that you thought the Russian people were getting fed up with it. That makes no difference to him, does it?
It makes no difference to him until the pressure really starts to grow. Now, the pressure, I think, could come in one of two ways. He's mitigating the pressure in one way because the largest group of people that they are conscripting and into their military are coming from eastern Russia. They're paid quite generous bounties to join. If they're killed and seriously wounded, their families paid quite a serious bounty. And if they complain, that is removed. So the population in Western Russia is being largely insulated from the casualty figures, if you like. But they're not being insulated from the increase in inflation. They're not being insulated from the increase in interest rates. They're not being insulated from the decline in living standards in Russia. And I think despite the vice-like control they have over the state media and therefore the ability to clamp down, I think there could well come a moment if economic sanctions are strengthened and the policing of those sanctions are strengthened and long-range missiles are made available, such could strike deep into Russia, military targets deep into Russia, not civilian targets, then this war will start to come home to the opinion formers around Moscow, and that must eventually have some effect. It may take time.
We are in that space between peace and war. Which way are we moving?
I'd like us to move back towards peace. I think the way we will do that is prepare for war. Prepare for war in such a way that any potential adversary can look at us and say, these people are taking their own security seriously. They're putting the right amount of resource into their own security. I'm not going to tangle with them. If you want to have peace, prepare for war. There is a danger if we don't increase our expenditure towards that 3.5% figure by any sooner than 2035. I mean, that is 10 years from now. Many analysts believe that the Russian military will have been able to reconstitute itself in the next 3 to 5 years, that it could become adventuristic again. Now, they'll probably have the best chance to do that if some form of ceasefire is agreed in Ukraine. Now, is that going to come about? It comes back to the terms of the negotiations going on at the present moment. Trump is very keen to appear to do a deal with Putin pretty much over Zelensky's head. And I think it's certainly immoral. I think it's illegal and unconstitutional for Trump to be forcing Zelensky to voluntarily give up any of those 4 provinces and potentially 4 million Ukrainian people.
You said as well, at the end of the Second World War, was it 19% of GDP that we were spending on defence?
In 1940, it was
Yes.
46%.
46%.
And in 1939, as war broke out, it went to 19%.
19%. 3.5%, even if it went up to 5%, seems nothing.
It's nothing, but it is actually significant because the percentages we're talking about now translate into billions of pounds sterling of a much greater magnitude than it was in the 1930s.
Lord Dannatt, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it. Thanks for watching the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, then please press subscribe. Our thanks as well to our sponsors, Help Alert. If you'd like to try Help Alert free for 14 days, you can do so by contacting helpalert24.co.uk. If you're worried about somebody in your family falling over and not being able to get help, or if you're worried about it yourself, then please get in touch. Help Alert is available 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. If you need somebody, they'll be there. It could save your life.